She quietly stitched together her survival until a stranger in a dark suit stopped in front of her with an absurd request. "I need you to pretend to be my wife," he said. And in that instant, her world stopped. Between fear and compassion, she accepts the deal that would forever change the course of their lives. But even the most unlikely love is not safe when secrets from the past threaten everything they are still learning to feel. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. And now on with the story. At the end of a stuffy March afternoon when the Chicago heat stubbornly lingered, despite spring knocking at the door, Sarah Miller was walking through Daly Plaza with her worn-out tote bag full of fabric scraps and thread. The scene around her was the usual. People rushing to catch the L train, street vendors hawking cold water, tourists snapping photos of the Picasso statue. She went unnoticed, just as she'd preferred ever since life taught her that drawing attention can sometimes cost you dearly. Sarah was 29, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had already lived entire lifetimes. A widow for 3 years, she had learned to survive the hard way, alone, working hard, and saying little. She lived in a simple boarding house on a quiet street in Pilsen, in a small room she shared with her old Singer sewing machine and a few boxes of second-hand clothes she mended to sell at the neighborhood flea market. Her routine was predictable. Wake up early, sew until her eyes grew tired, walk through the loop offering alteration services, and head home when night fell. No parties, no romance, no big dreams, just the dignity of earning her own keep without asking anyone for a favor. She was beautiful without knowing it, or perhaps without wanting to know. Her brown hair was always tied back in a simple bun. Her honey-colored eyes avoided prolonged contact, and she had a discreet way of walking that didn't draw attention, but didn't go completely unseen either. The other women at the boarding house said she was wasting her youth, that she should go out more, meet people. But Sarah knew that in her community a young widow who went out too much would be judged before she even opened her mouth. So she chose silence, routine, invisibility. That afternoon she had just delivered 3 pairs of hemmed pants to a client in Wicker Park and was heading toward the bus stop when she heard hurried footsteps behind her. She paid them no mind. Chicago was like that, everyone always in a rush, always late for some important meeting. But the footsteps didn't stop. They got closer, too close. When she turned her head, she found a man standing a few feet away, looking directly at her, tall, wearing a dark suit that seemed far too expensive for the heat. He had something in his eyes that made her stop too. It wasn't desire, it wasn't curiosity, it was desperation. Ethan Cole was 36 and a well-known name throughout the city. A real estate mogul, owner of one of the most respected development firms in the Midwest, he always appeared in the papers with the same serious expression, the same absolute control. The only son of a tycoon who built an empire and died, leaving not just a fortune, but also silent commitments and agreements that Ethan discovered far too late. He lived in a penthouse on Lakeshore Drive with a view of Lake Michigan, in a space so large and empty that he sometimes forgot which room he'd left his phone in. The people who worked for him respected him with that kind of respect mixed with fear. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, but his word was final. He had a discreet housekeeper named Mrs. Irene who had been taking care of the home for 20 years and knew his silences better than anyone. He had a trusted driver, Walt, who took him from one appointment to another without asking questions, and he had an executive assistant, Laura, who organized his professional life with military precision but could never organize the emptiness he carried inside. Ethan had never been one to open up. He grew up hearing from his father that men don't cry, don't show weakness, don't ask for help. He built his life on that philosophy, believing that control was synonymous with strength. But in recent months, that control had started to crack, all because of a document he found in his father's safe 2 months after the funeral. An agreement. A damned agreement signed decades ago when his father was just starting out in business and needed capital. Powerful investors, people with heavy last names and political influence, who had lent money under specific conditions. One of them, absurd and archaic, stipulated that the succession of the company would only be complete and free from outside interference if the heir started a family by his 37th birthday. Otherwise, the investors would have the right to claim a majority stake, potentially dismantling everything that had been built. Ethan thought it was ridiculous, medieval, impossible to be legally valid. But his lawyers, after weeks of analysis, confirmed it. The agreement had enough legal loopholes to be used as a weapon. And the investors, now represented by their equally powerful children and grandchildren, had already made it clear they intended to use that weapon. Not because they needed the money, but for the pleasure of proving they were still in charge. Ethan's 37th birthday was in 3 days. 3 days for him to present a wife or watch his empire crumble. He had tried everything, looked for legal loopholes, tried to negotiate, considered arranged marriages with acquaintances from high society. But all the women in his circle wanted something in return. A name, status, money, power. And he knew any one of them could turn on him at the right moment. That's when he saw Sarah. It wasn't planned. It wasn't a strategy. He was coming back from a frustrating meeting with his lawyers, walking through the plaza to clear his head when he saw her. She was crossing the square with that tote bag, that quiet demeanor, that expression of someone carrying the world on her shoulders but not complaining. And something in him recognized something in her. Maybe the loneliness, maybe the dignity, maybe the way she survived without pretending to be more than she was. He didn't think. He just acted. Sarah was still looking at him when Ethan took the first steps in her direction. Her heart sped up, not from fear but from confusion. This man, clearly from another world, was coming to talk to her. Why? When he stopped in front of her, Sarah noticed he was trembling. Slightly, almost imperceptibly, but he was trembling. His hands, his voice, something in him was on the edge. "I need to speak with you, Ma'am," he said, and the formality sounded strange coming from someone so young. "Are you okay, sir?" Sarah asked, instinctively concerned. She had this gift of worrying about others before protecting herself. "No," he answered with brutal honesty. "I'm not." People passed by, some glancing out of the corner of their eyes, curious about the strange scene. A man in an expensive suit talking to a plainly dressed woman in the middle of the plaza. Sarah felt the weight of their stares and took a step back. "I don't know what you want, but—" "I need your help," Ethan interrupted, and then he said the sentence that would change everything. "I need you to pretend to be my wife. Just for a few days, just for the world to see." Sarah thought she had misheard. She looked around, searching for hidden cameras, expecting someone to jump out yelling it was a prank show. But there was no one. Just this desperate man in front of her, with eyes that pleaded without pride. "Are you crazy?" she said quietly but firmly. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I'm desperate, and desperate people do crazy things." Sarah started walking, trying to get away, but he followed, keeping a respectful distance. "I know how this sounds," Ethan continued, speaking quickly, as if he were afraid she would disappear before he could say everything. "I know I'm a complete stranger. I know this is absurd, but I have no one else to turn to." "And why me?" Sarah stopped walking and faced him. "Why me, of all people? Someone you don't even know?" Ethan took a deep breath. "Because when I looked at you, I saw someone honest, someone who wouldn't sell me out, someone I could trust." "You don't know me well enough to trust me." "I know," he said, and there was a deep sadness in that admission. "But I need to believe there are still good people in this city, and I chose to believe in you." Sarah felt a strange flutter in her chest. It had been a long time since anyone had placed their trust in her, a long time since anyone had seen her as more than the poor widow from the boarding house. And this man, with all his money and power, was standing in front of her, vulnerable in a way she recognized. "What you're asking could destroy my reputation," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I'm a widow. I live in a community where people talk. If I suddenly show up married to a man I don't even know—" "I understand," Ethan said, "and that's why I'll compensate you, financially, whatever is fair." Sarah felt as if she'd been slapped. "You think this is about money?" "No," he answered too quickly. "I didn't mean it like that. I don't know how to do this right. I've never asked for help before." The silence that fell between them was heavy. Sarah looked at the man, and saw, for the first time, not the powerful mogul but the frightened human being. And she, who knew fear intimately, who had spent sleepless nights after her husband was gone wondering how she would survive, recognized that terror of being alone against the world. "Explain it to me properly," she said finally. "What's happening? Why this?" And there in the middle of the plaza, with the sun beginning to set and the city lights starting to flicker on, Ethan told her, not everything, but enough. He told her about the agreement, the deadline, the threat of losing everything. He told her how he had looked for other options and they had all failed. He spoke of his fear of disappointing everyone who depended on him, the company's employees, the families who lived off the jobs he provided. Sarah listened in silence, and the more he spoke, the more she understood that this wasn't a whim. It was real desperation. "And if I agree," she asked slowly, "what would it be like?" Ethan explained. A quick civil ceremony, living in his penthouse for a few days to make it look credible, minimal public appearances. Then, once the deadline passed and he was safe, a quiet divorce, a generous financial settlement, and they would each go their separate ways. "It sounds simple when you put it like that," Sarah murmured. "But it's not," Ethan admitted. "I know it's not. I know I'm asking for a lot, but I swear on my mother's memory that I will respect you. No obligations, nothing you don't want." Sarah closed her eyes. She thought of the boarding house, the cramped little room, the bills that never seemed to end. She thought of the clients who sometimes complained about the price of her alterations, of the late nights sewing until her fingers ached. She thought of the husband who was gone, of the grief she carried like a second skin, and she thought of something she hadn't felt in a long time, the possibility of change. "I need a night to think about it," she said. "I don't have a night," Ethan replied, and the honesty stung. "I have until noon tomorrow." Sarah looked at him, at this man who had everything and yet had nothing, and she made the craziest decision of her life. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. "Not for the money, because no one deserves to be destroyed by a damned agreement they didn't choose." Ethan closed his eyes, and for a moment it looked like he might collapse right there. "Thank you," was all he could manage to say. And so, without a kiss, without a ring, without any witnesses besides the indifferent city, two strangers made a deal that would change everything. The next day they met at City Hall. Sarah had worn her best dress, a simple blue one she had sewn herself. Ethan was in the same suit as the day before, but he looked even more tired. The clerk looked at them strangely but didn't ask any questions. Signed, stamped, registered. And just like that, Sarah Miller was Sarah Cole. Outside the courthouse, reality hit. They were married on paper, but they were two complete strangers. "My place is on Lakeshore Drive," Ethan said hesitantly. You need to come with me now, so people will see." Sarah swallowed hard and nodded. She got into his car, a black sedan with leather seats that smelled new. Walt drove in silence, glancing at them in the rearview mirror with poorly disguised curiosity. The penthouse was everything Sarah had imagined, and yet nothing she expected. Large, luxurious, with a view of the lake, but cold. So cold she felt like grabbing a coat despite the heat outside. Mrs. Irene greeted her politely, but the housekeeper's eyes scanned Sarah from head to toe, trying to understand who this woman was, who had appeared out of nowhere. "I'll show you to your room," Ethan said, and Sarah followed him down a long hallway. The room was bigger than her entire space at the boarding house. A huge bed, a walk-in closet, a private bathroom. Sarah put her small suitcase on the floor and suddenly felt the full weight of her decision. "I'll let you get some rest," Ethan said from the doorway. "If you need anything, just ask Mrs. Irene." "Ethan," Sarah called before he left. It was the first time she had said his name. He stopped, turned. "Are we going to be able to make this work?" she asked, and there was real fear in her voice. Ethan looked at this woman who had agreed to help him without even knowing him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than desperation. He felt hope. "We're going to try," he said, and night, in separate rooms of that enormous silent penthouse, two strangers who now shared a last name tried to sleep, knowing they had just entered a game whose rules they didn't fully understand yet. The first week, as Sarah Cole, was stranger than she could have ever imagined. Waking up in that enormous room with sheets that smelled of lavender and a view of Lake Michigan that looked like a postcard was like living in someone else's dream. But every time she looked in the mirror and saw her own tired face, she remembered this was no fairy tale. It was a deal, a public lie. And lies, no matter how well-intentioned, always have a price. Ethan kept his distance. He left early for work, came back late, and when they were in the same room, they spoke with the formality of two office colleagues. Mrs. Irene tried to be friendly, but Sarah could see the confusion in the housekeeper's eyes. This was not a normal wife. There was no affection, no intimacy, nothing but a polite and tense coexistence. Sarah tried to find her place in this house that wasn't hers. She woke up early as she always had, but she had no sewing to do, no work to chase after. For the first time in her life, she had free time, and she discovered that too much free time can be a different kind of prison. On the third day, she couldn't stand being idle any longer. She found Mrs. Irene in the kitchen and offered to help. The housekeeper, surprised, tried to politely refuse, but Sarah insisted. And so it was, side by side, peeling potatoes and seasoning meat, that the two women began to really talk. "How many years have you worked here?" Sarah asked. 22 years, Mrs. Irene replied with pride in her voice. "I started when Ethan was still a boy. I saw him grow up, saw him lose his mother, saw him become a man." "And his father?" Mrs. Irene paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "His father was a difficult man. He loved his son, I never doubted that. But he had a hard way of showing love. He thought preparing the boy for the world meant teaching him not to need anyone." Sarah understood a lot in that moment. She understood why Ethan had so much trouble asking for help, why he always seemed in control even when he was falling apart inside. "And he never had anyone? A girlfriend? A fiancé?" Sarah asked, and felt a strange warmth in her cheeks as she asked the question. Mrs. Irene smiled sadly. "There were a few young women, yes, but never anything serious. Ethan always thought relationships were a distraction, that he needed to focus on work, on business, on maintaining what his father built, until that became his whole life, and by the time he realized it, he was alone. That evening, Ethan came home earlier than usual. He found Sarah and Mrs. Irene in the kitchen, laughing about some old story, and he stood in the doorway just watching. It had been so long since that house had the sound of genuine laughter. "Good evening," he said, and the two women turned. "You're home early today," Mrs. Irene commented with a motherly smile. "Finished everything I needed to," Ethan lied. The truth was, he had left early because he couldn't stand being away from this house that suddenly felt less empty. "Dinner's almost ready," Sarah said, and there was something different in her voice. Less formality, more ease. They ate dinner together for the first time. Not in his office, not with plates served by Mrs. Irene, but at the kitchen table, like normal people. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he had eaten like this, without checking his phone, without thinking about meetings, just eating and talking. Sarah told him about the boarding house, about her funniest clients, about the time she had to fix a wedding dress an hour before the ceremony because the bride had gained weight and the zipper wouldn't close. Ethan laughed, a real laugh that surprised even himself. "And you?" Sarah asked. "How did you get started in the business?" Ethan's smile faded a little. "I didn't start, I inherited it. My father built everything, and I just keep it going." "Just keep it going," Sarah repeated, with that way she had of taking words and giving them back with a different weight. "Mrs. Irene told me you doubled the size of the company in the last 5 years. That's not just keeping it going." Ethan was quiet for a moment. No one had ever put it that way. People always said he was lucky, that he was born with a silver spoon, that everything had been easy because of his father. But Sarah saw it differently. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for saying that." It was later that night after dinner, when Sarah had gone to her room and Ethan was in his office trying to work, that the phone rang. It was Laura, his assistant. "Ethan, we have a problem," she said, her tone grave. "What kind of problem?" "The investors' lawyers are requesting a meeting." Tomorrow. They want to meet your wife in person. Ethan felt his stomach drop. Already? It seems someone commented on the sudden marriage. They're suspicious. They want to make sure it's not just a ploy to fulfill the contract. After he hung up, Ethan stared out the window for a long time, at the city lights below. He had hoped that with the marriage registered, he could buy some time. But these people weren't going to make it easy. They wanted blood. He knocked on Sarah's bedroom door. She opened it wearing a simple robe, her hair down for the first time since he'd met her. Ethan was speechless for a second. "Did something happen?" she asked, noticing the tension on his face. "They want to meet you," Ethan said. "Tomorrow. The investors' lawyers." Sarah felt fear tighten in her chest. "And what should I do?" Just be yourself," Ethan said. "You don't have to pretend to be someone else. You just have to pretend we've known each other longer. What if they ask things I don't know how to answer?" Ethan entered the room, pulled up a chair, and sat in front of her. "Then we'll practice. Now. All night, if we have to." And that's what they did. Sitting across from each other like two actors memorizing a script, they created a story. How they met when they started dating, how he proposed. They invented details, that she liked her coffee black, that he had a habit of organizing things alphabetically, that their first dinner had been at a steakhouse near the downtown market. But in the midst of the lies, truths began to emerge. Ethan told her about his mother, how she died when he was 15, and how that had changed everything. Sarah told him about her husband, how he was kind but weak, how she had learned to be strong when he couldn't be. When the clock struck 3 a.m, they were too tired to continue. But something had changed. They were no longer two strangers with a signed piece of paper. They were two people who had shared their pain. The meeting took place in Ethan's office, in a high-rise on LaSalle Street. Sarah wore an outfit Mrs. Irene had helped her pick out, elegant but not over the top, sober but not sad. When she walked into the conference room, holding Ethan's hand, she felt all eyes on her. There were 3 men, lawyers in impeccable suits with calculated expressions and eyes that measured and judged every move. The oldest, a grey-haired man named Mr. Harrison, led the conversation. "Mrs. Cole," he began, and the way he said the name sounded almost like an accusation. "What a pleasure to finally meet you." "The pleasure is mine," Sarah replied, and her voice didn't waver. The questions started subtly. Where they met, how long they'd been together, why they married so quickly. Sarah answered everything as they had rehearsed, but with a touch of truth that made the lie more believable. She spoke of how kind Ethan had been, how she had felt safe with him, how sometimes love happens when you least expect it. Mr. Harrison listened with the neutral expression of someone who doesn't believe but can't prove it. Then he changed tactics. "Are you aware of the agreement that prompted this marriage?" Ethan tensed beside her, but Sarah remained calm. "I know there's an old agreement related to the company. I know my husband needed to meet certain conditions. But I didn't marry him because of some piece of paper. I married him because I wanted to." "How very convenient," one of the other lawyers muttered. "Convenient would have been staying in my simple life without getting involved in any complications," Sarah retorted, and there was fire in her voice now. "Convenient would have been not leaving my routine, my clients, my independence to come live in a place where everyone looks at me like I'm a gold digger. But I'm here, because I chose to be." The silence that followed was thick. Mr. Harrison looked at Ethan, then at Sarah, and something in his gaze shifted. Respect. Perhaps. Or just the realization that she wouldn't be easy to break. "Very well," he said finally. "We'll be in touch." When they left the meeting, Ethan and Sarah walked in silence to the elevator. Only when the doors closed and they were alone did he speak. "You were incredible." "I was terrified," Sarah admitted, and only then did he notice she was trembling. "But you didn't show it. You were brave. Courage isn't not being afraid, it's being afraid and doing it anyway." Ethan looked at her, at this woman who had entered his life as a stranger and was becoming... what? He couldn't define it. He only knew that when she said she had chosen to be there, a part of him had wanted to believe it wasn't just a lie. In the days that followed, their routine changed. Ethan started coming home earlier. They ate dinner together. They talked about their day. Sarah mentioned she missed sewing, and he converted one of the spare rooms into a studio for her, with a new machine and materials she could never have afforded. "You didn't have to," she said when she saw it. "I wanted to," he replied, and it was true. It was also around this time that the gossip started. Tabloid websites, social media, people who knew neither of them but had strong opinions. They called Sarah an opportunist. They said Ethan had lost his mind. They speculated about pregnancy, scams, ulterior motives. The words were cruel, and even though Sarah tried to ignore them, they hurt. One night, Ethan found her in the studio, sewing with red-rimmed eyes. She had been crying. "I read them," he said, referring to the comments. "You shouldn't have," Sarah replied, without stopping her work. "They're wrong. About you. About us." "Are they?" she asked, finally stopping to look at him. "What are we, Ethan? Are we a lie, or are we real? Because sometimes I don't even know anymore." Ethan moved closer, sat beside her. "In the beginning, it was a lie, but now what?" He took her hand, and it was the first time they had truly touched, not for the cameras, not for show. "Now I don't know, but I know that when you're here, this house feels like a home, and when you're not, it goes back to being just an empty place." Sarah's heart pounded. This was dangerous. This could hurt. She had made a deal knowing it would end, that they would each go their own way. But how? Do you go your own way when your heart has already chosen to stay? "Ethan, we can't," she began, but he cut her off. I know it wasn't supposed to be like this. I know you're going to leave when this is all over. But I needed you to know that this isn't just an act for me, not anymore." Sarah closed her eyes. That confession was everything she wanted to hear and everything she feared most, because she had felt it too. She had also realized that the lie had turned into something else, something more real and more frightening. "What if we get hurt?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "What if we don't give ourselves the chance to find out?" he answered. They sat there, hands intertwined, in silence, while outside the city continued to judge, to talk, to speculate. But inside that makeshift studio, two hearts were beginning to negotiate a deal that wasn't on paper, a deal of maybes, of what-ifs, of possibilities. And for the first time since it all began, both Ethan and Sarah allowed themselves to imagine that this lie could have a real ending. Even without knowing that, the worst was yet to come, that there were untold secrets, revelations that would change everything, and a decision that would test not the agreement between them, but what they had started to build beyond it. That night, when Sarah returned to her room, she couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened, about how life can surprise you even when you think you've seen it all. She thought about the husband she'd lost, the pain she'd carried, the certainty she'd had that she would never let herself feel anything for anyone again. And she thought of Ethan, this man who had come into her life with a desperate plea and was slowly occupying spaces she thought had died along with her grief. Across the hall, Ethan was also awake. He stared at the documents scattered on his desk, but saw nothing. He could only think about how foolish he'd been to think he could control this, that he could keep his distance, that it would be just a cold, calculated transaction. Sarah had messed up all his plans. Not with scandals or drama, but with kindness, with her presence, with that way she had of turning a house into a home without asking permission. And now he was in love, with a woman who had agreed to pretend, who would leave as soon as this was over, who had every right to never want to see him again, after everything he'd put her through. The two of them in separate rooms, thinking of each other, unaware that the storm about to hit would force them to decide. Was this a pretense that became real, or something real that was born from pretense? And in the end, did the difference even matter? The revelation came on a rainy Friday, the kind where Chicago seems to grind to a halt as the water pours down and Lake Michigan churns. Ethan had left early for an important meeting, and Sarah was alone in the penthouse, sewing a dress for one of Mrs. Irene's friends, when the landline rang. She hesitated before answering. It wasn't her habit to answer the phone in someone else's home, but it rang so many times she thought it might be urgent. "Hello," she answered. There was a pause on the other end. Then a female voice, young, controlled. "Who am I speaking with?" "This is Sarah. Can I help you?" Another pause, longer this time. "Sarah Cole." The way the woman said the name sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. There was something there, a hint of surprise mixed with another emotion she couldn't identify. "Yes. And you are?" "Someone who really needs to speak with Ethan. Urgently. Can you have him call me?" "Of course." "What's your name?" "Caroline. He'll know who it is." And before Sarah could ask anything else, the line went dead. She stood there holding the phone with a strange weight in her chest. Caroline, Ethan had never mentioned anyone with that name. When he got home that night, soaked from the rain despite his umbrella, Sarah was in the living room, waiting. "Someone named Caroline called for you," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. Ethan froze. His expression changed so quickly that Sarah knew instantly. That name meant something, something big. "What did she say?" he asked, his voice filled with real urgency. "Just that you should call her back. She said it was urgent." Sarah paused. "Who is she, Ethan?" He ran a hand through his wet hair, letting drops fall onto the hardwood floor. "It's complicated." "Everything in your life seems to be complicated," Sarah replied, a new sadness in her voice. "But I thought we agreed to be honest with each other, as much as possible." Ethan sighed and sat on the sofa, looking more tired than ever. "Caroline was someone important, a long time ago." "A girlfriend?" "A fiancée, almost." Sarah felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. "And why did you never mention her?" "Because it ended badly, very badly, and I don't like to talk about it. But she calls here at, your home saying it's urgent and you don't think you need to explain." Ethan looked at her, his eyes a mix of guilt and defensiveness. "Sarah, you and I have an agreement. I don't have to tell you every detail of my past life." It was like a slap in the face. Sarah stood up, trembling. "An agreement. It always comes back to that, doesn't it? When it's convenient, we're a couple. When it's not, we're an agreement. It's not like that." "Then what is it like, Ethan? Explain it to me, because I'm confused. I'm living here, sharing a life with you, feeling things I shouldn't be feeling, and you're reminding me that this is just a deal?" Ethan stood up too, moving closer to her. "You know it's more than that. You know how I feel." "Do I? Because sometimes it seems like you feel something, but then a Caroline shows up and I remember that I don't really know anything about you." "I'm going to call her," Ethan said, grabbing his phone. "I'll handle this, and then we'll talk." He went into his office and closed the door. Sarah was left alone in the living room, listening to the rain beat against the window, feeling that something had cracked between them. Mrs. Irene appeared with a cup of tea, placing it in her hand without a word, just giving her that motherly look that understood without needing an explanation. Ethan's call with Caroline lasted almost an hour. When he came out of the office, his face was like stone. "She wants to see me," he said. "Tomorrow." "And you're going?" "I have to. It's about the past, about things I thought were settled." "Are you going to tell me what it is?" Sarah asked, but she already knew the answer. "Not yet, please, trust me, just a little longer." Sarah wanted to scream that trust is built on truth, not secrets, but she was too tired to fight. So she just nodded and went to her room, closing the door slowly, as if afraid that slamming it would break everything for good. The next day, Ethan left early. He didn't say where he was going, and Sarah didn't ask. She spent the entire day restless, sewing but unable to concentrate, pricking her finger, mismeasuring until she finally gave up and went for a walk. She left the penthouse without telling anyone, took the elevator, and when she stepped onto the street, she felt the city as if for the first time. She had gotten so used to this penthouse life, with a car and driver, with people calling her Mrs. Cole, that she had forgotten what it was like to just be Sarah. She walked aimlessly, ending up in Lincoln Park, where families were having picnics and kids were playing soccer. She sat on a bench and just watched life happen. A woman passed with a baby in a stroller. An elderly couple walked hand in hand. A group of teenagers laughed at some inside joke, and Sarah wondered, what was she doing? She had agreed to help Ethan out of compassion, out of principle, because no one deserved to be destroyed by an unjust agreement. But at some point, it had stopped being about helping him and had become about herself, about what she was feeling, about the fear of getting hurt again. When she returned to the penthouse, it was getting dark. Ethan was there, sitting in the living room, waiting. And from the look on his face, she knew the conversation with Caroline had been heavy. "We need to talk," he said. Sarah sat far from him on the opposite arm of the sofa. "I'm listening." Ethan took a deep breath. "Caroline and I were engaged 7 years ago. We were going to get married. Everything was planned, church booked, invitations sent. My father was still alive and he adored her. Said she was the perfect woman for me, from the right circle, the right family. What happened? 2 weeks before the wedding, I found out she was having an affair with one of my father's business partners. A married man, 20 years older. I found out by accident, saw them together in a situation that left no doubt." Sarah felt a pang of pain for him. "And you called everything off?" "I did, in front of everyone. It was a huge scandal. The families fought. My father never forgave me for exposing the situation publicly. Caroline disappeared from the city. It was the worst time of my life." "And why is she back now?" Ethan looked down at his hands. "Because she heard about my marriage, and she came to tell me she never stopped loving me, that the affair was a mistake, that if I still had to marry someone to fulfill the agreement, it should be her because we already had a history." Sarah felt her chest tighten. "And what did you say?" "I said it was too late. I said I'd moved on. I said I have a wife now." "A pretend wife," Sarah corrected, her voice soft. Ethan got up and went to her, kneeling in front of her. "Sarah, look at me." She looked, and his eyes were filled with an emotion she could no longer deny. "It started as a lie. I know. But what I feel for you isn't a lie. What happened here between us in this house wasn't an act. I fell in love with you for real." Tears came before Sarah could stop them. "Ethan, don't do this." "Don't do what? Don't tell the truth. Don't make me believe in something that might not last. I've already lost once. I've already been alone. I've already rebuilt my life from scratch. And I don't know if I can handle doing it again." "You won't have to do it alone," he said, holding her hands. "Because I'm not going to let you fall. Promises are easy to make. Keeping them is the hard part. Then let me prove it. Let me show you that this is real." Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to so badly, but the fear was stronger, so she did the only thing she could. She pulled away, stood up, put physical distance between them. "I need time," she said. "I need to think." Ethan respected that. He didn't push. He just nodded and watched her walk up the stairs toward her room, taking with her all the doubts and fears he had tried to soothe. That night, neither of them slept. Ethan stayed in his office, staring at the envelope he kept in his drawer, the damned agreement that had started it all. And he made a decision that would change the course of everything. Sarah, for her part, cried into her pillow like she hadn't cried since her husband had passed. She cried for the old grief that had never fully healed. She cried for the fear of loving again. She cried for the confusing emotions that consumed her. And she cried because deep down she already knew the answer her heart wanted to give, but her head wouldn't let it. The next day, Ethan had to attend an important public event, a charity dinner where many of the city's business leaders would be present. He needed to show up with his wife. He needed to keep up appearances in front of the people who still doubted the legitimacy of his marriage. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," he told Sarah at breakfast. "I know," she replied, "but I'm going, because I said I would help you, and I keep my promises." The event was at the Union League Club, an imposing place with crystal chandeliers and white-gloved waiters. Sarah wore a dress she had made herself, simple but elegant, in navy blue. Ethan was impeccable in a tuxedo, but his eyes were only on her. When they entered the ballroom, all conversation stopped for a second. The couple of the moment, the millionaire mogul and the widowed seamstress, the story the whole city was talking about. They greeted people, smiled for photos, played the part they needed to play. But there was a tension between them that anyone paying attention could feel. Mrs. Irene, who had come along to help Sarah, noticed and grew worried. It was in the middle of the evening, when Sarah had gone to the ladies' room to get a moment's peace, that she ran into Caroline. The woman was classically beautiful, blonde, tall, elegant. She was leaning against the counter when Sarah walked in, and the way she looked at her made it clear she knew exactly who Sarah was. "So you're the new Mrs. Cole," Caroline said, her sweet voice laced with venom. "And you must be Caroline," Sarah replied, maintaining her composure. "Did Ethan tell you about me?" "He did." Caroline gave a sad smile. "Did he tell you he loved me? That we were going to get married? That I was the great love of his life?" "He told me you cheated on him," Sarah answered firmly, "and that he moved on." "Moved on?" Caroline laughed, but it was a joyless sound. "Darling, a man like Ethan never forgets his first love. You might be his wife on paper, but I'll always be the one he really wanted." Sarah felt anger rise, but she controlled it. "You know the difference between you and me. You had your chance with him and you threw it away. I'm here by his side every day and he chose me. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to." "Do you really believe that?" Caroline stepped closer. "Or do you know, deep down, that this is just a deal for him to get what he needs?" It was as if Caroline had hit her exactly where it hurt, because that doubt was always there, hammering away in Sarah's mind. If you were in Sarah's shoes, would you believe Ethan's words or be afraid you were being used? Tell us in the comments. Sarah left the restroom without answering, returning to the ballroom with her head held high but her heart aching. She found Ethan talking to a group of businessmen, and when he saw her, his eyes lit up in a way that seemed too real to be fake. He excused himself from the group and came to her. "Is everything okay?" "I ran into Caroline in the restroom," Sarah said quietly. His face tensed. "What did she say?" "That you'll never forget her, that I'm just a replacement." Ethan took Sarah's hand right there in front of everyone. "Look at me," he pleaded. "Caroline is the past, a past I got over a long time ago. You are the present, you are the future. You are everything I didn't know I was looking for." "How can I be sure?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with supplication. "Because I'm going to show you," he said. "Tonight, right now." And then, in front of all the guests, the business leaders, the investors' lawyers who were there watching, Ethan walked up to the small stage where the event's host had spoken earlier. "May I have everyone's attention, please?" he said into the microphone. The ballroom fell. Silent, Sarah felt a wave of panic. What was he doing? "Many of you know the story of my marriage," Ethan began. "You know it was sudden, that it drew attention, that it generated gossip." People started to whisper. Sarah wanted to disappear. "And maybe you're right to question it. Maybe I deserve to be questioned, because the truth is, I didn't marry Sarah for love." He paused, and Sarah felt her world crumble. But then he continued. "I married her out of necessity, because of an old agreement that forced me to start a family, and I was desperate." The room erupted in murmurs. Ethan raised a hand for silence. "But what started as a necessity turned into the best decision of my life, because this woman taught me what honesty is. She taught me what courage is. She taught me that love isn't just a romantic feeling, it's a daily choice to stand by someone even when it's hard." He stepped down from the stage and walked towards Sarah, who had tears streaming down her face. "Sarah Miller Cole, I love you. And it's not a love born of convenience, it's a love born from truth, from living together, from getting to know the real you." He knelt there in front of everyone. "I know I started this all wrong. I know I put you in an unfair situation, but if you'll give me a chance to start over the right way, I promise I will spend the rest of my life showing you that you are not part of any deal. You are my choice." The entire ballroom was in absolute silence. Sarah looked at the man kneeling before her, at the vulnerability in his eyes, at the courage it took for him to expose everything, to risk his reputation, his pride, everything just to prove a point. And she knew that the answer was already in her heart, just waiting for the courage to be spoken. Sarah looked at Ethan kneeling in front of her, the entire ballroom watching, waiting for her answer. She could hear her own heart beating louder than the background music, louder than the curious whispers around them. And in that moment, she had to make a choice that went far beyond accepting or rejecting a public declaration. She had to choose whether to let fear win, or to be brave enough to believe again. "Get up," she said softly, extending her hand to him. Ethan stood, holding her hand, waiting. His eyes pleaded for an answer his mouth didn't dare ask for. "You put me in an impossible situation," Sarah began, and she saw him swallow hard. "You made me enter a world that isn't mine, pretend to be someone I wasn't, live a lie in front of an entire city." She paused, and she could feel the tension in the air. "But you also showed me that I could be more than I thought I was. You showed me I deserved to be chosen, to be valued, to be loved. And as much as this all started wrong," she squeezed his hand, "I love you too. And I want to try to make this work." It was as if the entire room let out a collective breath. Some people clapped, others smiled, and Caroline, who had been watching from a corner, turned her back and slipped out, taking with her the last remnants of a past that no longer had a place there. Ethan pulled Sarah into a hug, and for the first time since it all began, they truly embraced. Not for a camera, not to keep up appearances, just because they wanted to, because they needed to, because they could finally be honest about what they felt. "Let's go home," he whispered in her ear. They said their goodbyes quickly, ignoring the curious stares, and left hand in hand. Walt was waiting in the car, and in the rearview mirror the driver smiled discreetly, seeing them finally look like a real couple. During the ride, sitting in the back seat, Ethan held Sarah's hand as if he were afraid she would disappear if he let go. "I have something to show you," he said. "When we get home." At the penthouse, Ethan led Sarah to his office. He opened the drawer where he kept his most important documents and took out the thick envelope she had seen before, but never opened. "This is the agreement," he explained. "The one my father signed, the one that forced me to get married, the one that started this whole mess." Sarah looked at the envelope but didn't take it. "I don't need to read it," she said. "I know. But I need you to see what I'm going to do with it." Ethan took the envelope, opened it, and pulled out the papers inside. Pages and pages of legal terms, signatures, stamps, the paper prison that had controlled his life for so long. And then, in front of her, he tore it. He tore it all, page by page, until it was legal confetti scattered across his desk. "Ethan, what are you doing?" Sarah was shocked. "What if you need this? What if the investors—" "Let them come," he said, with a calm she had never seen in him. "I've already fulfilled the part of the agreement that mattered. I got married. I started a family. And if they want to challenge it, let them. But I will not let a piece of paper control my life anymore. Not when I've finally found what really matters." He took her hands. "Sarah, I want you to know that from now on, nothing I do is out of obligation. I'm not with you because I have to be. I'm with you because I want to be. And if you want to leave, if you want to start your life over away from me, I will respect that. But I will wait for you, because you're worth waiting for." Sarah looked at this man who had learned to let his guard down, to be vulnerable, to admit he needed someone. And she made a decision. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not now. Not after everything. But I need one thing from you. Anything. I need us to start over. The right way. No rush, no pressure. I need to get to know the real you, and for you to get to know the real me. Not the Sarah who became Mrs. Cole overnight, but the Sarah who sews, who lives in a boarding house, who has doubts and fears. And the Ethan who has imposter syndrome, who sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night afraid he's doing everything wrong, who can't even cook an egg but loves watching you cook," he completed, smiling. "Exactly." They started right there. That night, Sitting on the office floor, surrounded by shredded paper, they talked until the sun came up. They talked about everything they had never talked about before: childhoods, dreams, regrets, hopes. Ethan told her about his mother, how she died of cancer and he couldn't be there because he was on a business trip his father insisted was important. Sarah told him about her husband, how their relationship had been more about companionship than passion, and how she had felt guilty for not grieving as much as she thought she should. They discovered they both loved old movies, but never had time to watch them. That neither of them could dance well but would like to learn. That Ethan was afraid of heights, but lived in a penthouse because he thought it was what was expected of him. That Sarah loved waking up early to see the sunrise, something she had stopped doing. When she moved to the boarding house because her room didn't have a good window. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky orange and pink, they were exhausted, but closer than they had ever been. "Good morning, wife," Ethan said, and this time the word didn't sound like a pretense. "Good morning, husband," Sarah replied and smiled. The following days were about rebuilding. Ethan arranged a meeting with his lawyers and the investors' representatives. He presented the complete marriage documentation, explained the situation with brutal honesty, and made it clear he was prepared to face any legal challenge if necessary. But he would no longer live as a hostage to an agreement he hadn't chosen. To everyone's surprise, Mr. Harrison, the oldest of the investors' lawyers, smiled for the first time. "You know, Cole, your father was a friend of mine," he said, "and he made me promise to uphold this agreement to ensure you didn't turn into some irresponsible playboy. But seeing you now, fighting for the woman you love, defending your principles, I think he would be proud. The agreement is fulfilled. The company is yours, uncontested." Ethan couldn't speak. He just nodded, shook the man's hand, and walked out feeling a weight he didn't even know he was carrying, finally lifted from his shoulders. Sarah, for her part, had her own journey. She went back to the boarding house, not to live, but to say goodbye to the women who had been her family when she had no one. She brought gifts, thanked them for their kindness, and explained that she would keep sewing, but now from a different place, with different possibilities. "Did you get lost in that rich world?" Mrs. Davis, the owner of the boarding house, asked with her typical bluntness. "No," Sarah answered honestly. "I found myself. I discovered I can be more than I thought without losing who I am." She opened a small studio on the ground floor of the penthouse building, a space where she served all kinds of clients, from her friends at the boarding house who needed alterations to the socialites who discovered that this seamstress had real talent. The work made her happy, and Ethan loved coming home to find her focused at her machine, with that serious expression she made when she was measuring fabric. They established routines: breakfast together whenever possible, a candlelit dinner once a week, not at a fancy restaurant, but right at their kitchen table. Sundays in Lincoln Park, walking hand in hand and drinking coffee that Sarah had taught Ethan how to make just right. Mrs. Irene watched it all with a motherly smile, happy to see the house finally filled with life. Walt commented to her one afternoon, "That boy spent his whole life trying to be what his father wanted. Now he's finally being who he is." 6 months after their rushed ceremony at City Hall, Ethan woke Sarah up on a Saturday morning with breakfast in bed and an envelope. "What's this?" she asked, still sleepy. "Open it." Inside the envelope were 2 plane tickets to Hawaii and a reservation at a beachfront resort. "A honeymoon," Ethan explained. "The one we never had, the one I want to have with you. For real." Sarah felt her eyes well up with tears. "You didn't have to." "I know, but I want to. I want to take you somewhere beautiful. I want to wake up with you looking at the ocean. I want to have time that's just ours, with no work, no pressure, nothing but the two of us. And when we get back, life will still be complicated," Sarah said, ever the realist. "It will," Ethan agreed, "but we'll face it together, like we always should have from the start." The trip was everything they needed. Lazy days on the beach, late-night talks, swimming in crystal-clear water. One night, lying on the sand looking at the stars, Sarah finally said something out loud that she had been holding in for months. "I forgive you," she said, "for putting me in that situation, for starting everything wrong." I forgive you because I understand you were desperate. And desperate people make imperfect choices. Thank you, Ethan said, his voice full of relief. But I still regret not being honest from the beginning. And I regret taking so long to admit I was in love, Sarah confessed. I was so afraid of getting hurt again that I almost missed my chance to be happy. But you didn't miss it. No, we didn't. When they returned to Chicago, the city was the same, but they were different, more secure, more united, more certain that what they had built was real. A year after their City Hall wedding, they held a vow renewal ceremony. It wasn't big. There weren't hundreds of guests, just the people who truly mattered. Mrs. Irene, Walt, Laura, Sarah's friends from the boarding house, a few of Ethan's colleagues, and the priest who had baptized him as a child. In front of everyone, they repeated their vows, but this time they were real vows, chosen vows, vows that came from the heart. I, Ethan, choose you, Sarah, not out of obligation, not out of necessity, but because you are my home. Because with you I learned that vulnerability isn't weakness, that asking for help isn't defeat, and that loving truly is the bravest thing anyone can do. I, Sarah, choose you, Ethan, not for security, not for convenience, but because you showed me I can be strong and gentle at the same time. Because you taught me that starting over doesn't mean forgetting the past, it means honoring it by building a better future. When the priest said, "You may now kiss the bride," the kiss was different from all the others. It was a kiss that carried history, that carried overcome pain, that carried the promise of difficult days faced together and victories shared. And there, in that small Chicago church, two strangers who became partners in crime, who became friends, who became lovers, finally became what they should have been from the start, each other's choice. Life went on, as it always does. There were arguments, there were challenges, there were hard days. But there was also laughter in the kitchen, lazy Sundays, and small victories celebrated with hugs. Sarah expanded her studio and started teaching sewing classes to women in vulnerable situations. Ethan started a social project, using his construction company to renovate homes for families in need. They discovered that true love isn't like in the movies, where everything is perfect and there's no conflict. True love is waking up every day and choosing to stay, talking when things are hard instead of running away, building together even when it would be easier to give up. And whenever someone asked how they met, Ethan and Sarah would exchange that knowing look of people who share a special secret. "It's complicated," Ethan would say. "But it was worth every second," Sarah would add. And it was true. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive the way we expect. It doesn't start beautifully. It doesn't follow the script society has approved. Sometimes love is born from a desperate plea in a public square, from a deal that turns into truth, from two wounded hearts that decide to heal together. And when it's real, when it's chosen, when it's built brick by brick on a foundation of honesty and respect, that love can survive any storm. It can turn a lie into truth. It can make a family out of two strangers. Sarah and Ethan proved it. And they continue to prove every single day that the strongest love isn't the one that comes easy. It's the one that chooses to stay when it would be so much simpler to walk away. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Sarah and Ethan has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of two strangers who became partners, who transformed a desperate agreement into true love, click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments what part of this story resonated with you the most. Do you believe a relationship that starts off wrong can become the right one? Every day we bring you intense stories like this, revealing the deepest side of the human soul. Stories about second chances, about the courage to love again, about the strength we find when we decide not to give up. We'll see you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions and make you believe that no matter how it began, what matters is the choice we make every day to continue. Until next time, and thank you for joining us on this emotional journey.